Vadim was no more. Between the honey-sweet flame of the mead in his gut and the hot breath of the oven, he had long melted away into the comfort of the hall. He let himself sink down into his chair, heavy with the weight of smoked salmon blini and oozing farmer's cheese pierogi. The chair creaked resentfully beneath him. He smiled at its misfortune. "There, you see?" he said, stretching an arm across the back of his daughter's chair. "We can have mourning and grief every day of the year, but isn't it nice to have a full belly and good company for one evening, Masha?" She didn't look at him. She had wrapped her mother's blanket around herself tightly, as if to hide from the rest of the room. The only part of her Vadim could see from where he was sitting was one small, outstretched hand picking gingerly at the half-eaten blini cake in front of her. He watched her for a moment, and then, before the familiar doubts and fears could rise up to wrench his gut, he let out a slow breath through his nose and let himself fall back into the warmth of the mead. Somewhere, a gusli had begun to play. Family, friends of family, strangers whom his father intended the family to know by meal's end, all were lost in the ambient murmur of conversation beneath the music. Above it all, there was the voice of the bard, meandering through the poetry of the great heroes. Here was the galloping, mischievous song of Alyosha Popovich and how he fooled the evil half-dragon Tugarin Smievich. Here was the lilting, somber melody of Ilya Muromets and the death of his friend Svyatogor the giant. And here was the song of Vadim's own grandfather, Dobrynya Nikitich, sweeping and powerful in its telling of his battle with the dragon Gorinich. Vadim clapped with the rest of the room when the bard sang the final note of their 3-day-long struggle. Maria continued to pick silently at her food. "But that is no story," said the bard, gesturing for the room to calm. "If it is dragons you want, there is only one man among the Bogatiri who will please you." He raised his eyebrows at Vadim's father. "Shall we have the tale of Krovyapet Dobrynych and the 12 draughts?" Vadim's father reclined in his chair, table groaning with relief as his great elbows lifted from it. "Shall we?" he said, stroking his beard. "This is my home. This is my family. Who here does not know the tale already? Why not move on to something more worthy, like Ilya and the Nightingale?" The bard looked to the rest of the room, made a sour face on their behalf, and shook his head. "We've all heard that one as well, Krovya. I'm getting tired of singing it. We are here to celebrate your christening, and this is your story. Let me tell it." Krovya gave him a hard look for several seconds, and then he shrugged and sighed and made a shooing motion with one hand. It was all the invitation the bard needed. He flourished with his pick hand in a way that sent the bells on his gusli strap jingling, and then placed his fingers on the strings. The melody he began to weave was so familiar to Vadim, he found himself mumbling along even through the mead. It was the story of a child born as good as dead, a boy who could not see, nor hear, nor feel, nor taste, who could not speak, nor cry out for attention. So still and quiet was he at birth, his father wondered if there was any life in him at all. It was Malyusha, his aunt, who saved him from an untimely burial. She saw in her sleep a vision of his father's old enemy, the dragon Gorinich, and the blood curse it had cast upon him before its final breath. She saw his seed, tainted with a poison that only the blood of dragons could cleanse. So it was that the great bogatyr Dobrynya Nikitich traveled once more to the lair of the beast, whose blood had so long ago seeped into the earth there. He drew only one draught from the soil, and this he fed to his son, which was only enough to give him sight. With nothing but a pair of working eyes and his father's spear, the boy began a lifelong hunt, slaying dragon after dragon, drinking draught after draught of their blood. After 5, he was whole. After 6, he was faster than any man ought to be. 7, and he could heft a horse with his bare hands. 12 draughts he drank in 12 years, until he was a warrior to rival any before him. The bard's fingers were climbing a crescendo into the music of Krovya's final draught, his victory against the hidden dragon Yakazatin, longest of all his hunts, and the rescue of Olesya Vladimirovna, who had been Vadim's wife, when there came the clatter of a wooden chair falling to the floor beside Vadim. The music jerked to a discordant halt, and time for everyone in the hall to watch Maria dash from the table and out through the doors. Their eyes all shifted to Vadim, who suddenly felt a degree closer to sobriety. Without thinking, he stood up and made a half-bow to the bard. "I am sorry," he began, and then paused, searching for the correct words. This has been a hard season for my family. Olyesia, the girl's mother, she left us at the end of winter. I thought the music and the company would be good for her. I suppose Masha still needs time. Pah! Krovya pretended to spit in mock disgust. Wait for the thing to fester and it will begin to stink. You were right to bring that girl here. She has been shutting herself away from the world more than she ought, and for too long. I want my granddaughter back. Ay, said Vadim's mother, batting at Krovya's elbow. The girl is in mourning, Yasha. You could stand to be a pinch gentler with her. Is she sleeping well, Vadimka? When your grandmother passed, I was plagued with the worst kind of dreams for a year. The answer was no, but he didn't want to say with several dozen ears trained on the conversation. His mother seemed to notice the way he was glancing about the room and whispered something to Krovya, who signaled for the bard to begin playing again. After the hall had fallen back into the hum of music and murmurs, Vadim joined his parents at their end of the table to continue the conversation, this time in a quieter tone. She has not been well since Olyesia's passing. I hear her most every night, muttering to herself in the dark. At first I thought the same as you, Mama, that she must be having bad dreams, but it is more than that. Masha is no longer the little rabbit we all knew. I see the changes all the time. She does not want stories anymore. She does not climb onto my back or beg me to pick her up. She keeps all to herself, staying out of doors all day long, walking beside the field. Even right now, in the middle of summer, she insists on covering herself all over with long coats and scarves. Her nursemaid tells me that there is nothing else for it. She must be blossoming into a woman. Krovya furrowed his brow. It was a strange look on his lined, indomitable face. He sat 2 heads taller than any other man at the table, and he was large enough in the shoulders and heavy enough to need a special chair the size of a small, carved wood throne. This was a man who drank the blood of dragons, and here he was, driven to silence by the mystery of womanhood. It was, in a way, a relief to Vadim to see so much of his feelings mirrored in his father's expression. Well, said his mother, that is unfortunate. The timing could not be any worse, could it? A girl needs a mother in her life to teach her these things. Give her time, Vadimka, and you must keep bringing her here. Your aunt and I will help however we can. No, said Krovya, louder than Vadim would have liked. You are the girl's father. It will be a hard life without her mother, so you must make her strong. None of this. He waved a hand indistinctly at his wife, who grimaced. Coddling. It will soften her to the world, and her wound will never heal. Do you understand? Vadim looked from his father's face to his mother's. Yes, Papa, he said with a small bow of his head. The rest of the evening passed slowly. Vadim had nothing more to drink and ate very little. In the end, when it became clear Maria had determined not to return to her seat, he made another apology to his mother and father, and to the bard, said his goodbyes, and found his daughter sitting in the yard, face buried in her mother's blanket. The walk home was quiet. Several times he attempted to ask her why she had run from the table, what she was feeling, what could be done. Some of these questions she answered with quiet tokens. I do not know, she would say, or I am sorry, always with a strange distance in her voice. Mostly, she said nothing at all.
You will have a song yet, boy.
The voice came from some place high above. It filled the world like thunder and shook Vadim's bones. He strained to see past the ink-stained clouds into the gray slate of the sky. In the distance, he saw a single mountain rising slowly from the horizon, a dark knife to scrape the heavens. It seemed to turn toward him, and now it wasn't a mountain at all, but a man, striding in earth-trembling steps over the miles between them. If he hadn't been raised on the tails, he might have thought to turn and run. Instead, he watched as the silhouette of Svyatogor the giant approached and took a knee before him. In his hand, he held the largest chalice Vadim had ever seen. His face was hidden in the clouds.
You were born into silence, as was I. Drink, and let your song begin.
The giant extended the cup to Vadim, who reached to receive it. And now, arms outstretched, he could tell it was not the cup that was too large for his hands, but his hands that were too small for the cup. They were the nervous, trembling hands of a child. The clouds had parted from the giant's face. The eyes staring back at him belonged to his father. He felt rough hands close around his own, showing him where to hold the cup. Vadim remembered. He remembered the way his father had woken him in the night so many years ago. He remembered standing together beside the oven, quiet while the rest of the family slept. He remembered the iron and ash taste of the dragon's blood, the way it oozed hot down the back of his throat. He remembered the disappointment in his father's eyes when, day after day, nothing ever came from it. Vadim held the cup in both hands, staring into the dark liquid.
"Drink,"
his father repeated. His voice was tinged with something different, a cold edge.
"Drink, Vadimka."
Something familiar, but wrong.
"Drink, drink, drink."
It began to chant, falling further from the sound of Krovya's voice with each repetition. He looked up. 2 enormous, glassy eyes stared out of the darkness at him. They were set into the gray face of his wife, Ulyesya. He was standing in her coffin, an insect of a man beneath her giant, lolling head. Blood trickled in a thin line from her mouth into his cup.
"Drink, drink, drink."
His hands wanted to move the cup to his lips.
"Drink, drink, drink."
As her husband, as his son, as her father, he ought to.
"Drink."
With a jerk of his head, as if trying to pull away from the cup, he forced himself awake. The room was still dark. The air was hot and damp. His mouth was blessedly dry. He sat up and wiped the sweat from his face. The bed was as empty as it had been since Ulyesya passed, as empty as it had ever been. They'd stopped sleeping together long before she left. He stayed in that position for a long time, sitting, thinking about all the nightmares he'd ever had and how different this one felt. The thought of the blood in the cup that night had been something he'd buried away. He hadn't even shared it with his mother. It was an unwelcome memory full of misgivings and doubts. He had almost fooled himself into thinking it was a childhood delusion. He held his face in his hands. The thought didn't belong in his head, but now that it was back, what was there to do? Every minute detail seemed to be crossing the years to find him. The warm plaster of the oven against his fingertips, the quiet breathing of his cousins somewhere in the house, the tiny bubbles gathered at the top of the dark liquid. Everything rushed back into him, as fresh as the night it had happened. He was in the middle of reconstructing what his father's face had looked like before the hair had all gone silver, when he heard something from the kitchen. He lifted his head out of his hands and listened. It was the sound of Maria's voice, muttering softly in her sleep. She'd been sleeping on the shelf of the great clay oven in the kitchen for weeks, complaining the summer nights were somehow still too cold for her. He let out a long breath, ran his hands over his aching face one last time, and rose slowly onto his feet. If it was a nightmare, perhaps she'd be grateful for someone to interrupt. He would have been. He paused with his hand on the kitchen door. She was talking to herself, yes. He was no stranger to the sound. But this close, there was something strange in it. She sounded so much more peaceful in her sleep than in waking. He heard her giggle and pressed a hand over his mouth as if to suppress a gasp. He'd almost forgotten the sound of it. "What are you doing, Papa?" she whispered. Vadim went still, held his breath in his chest. "You cannot fit in the oven. You're too big." He let it out in a quiet rush. Pleasant nonsense, the dreams of a child given voice. He took his hand from his mouth and leaned on the doorframe, listening. "I am whispering, Papa. No, do not make me go to bed. I will be quiet. I will." In her delirium, she seemed to have realized she was still muttering a bit too loud and lowered her voice to a whisper. "See?" Stubborn, more talkative than was good for her. Arguing with him even while he was away. Vadim chuckled noiselessly to himself, resting his head against the doorframe. That was the girl he had raised. That was his Masha. He stayed and listened to the sound of her voice for a while longer. His father's cup seemed very far away. Galina sat on a stool beside the oven, tapping a wooden spoon impatiently against the cast-iron pot inside. "Will you stop that?" The old nursemaid shot Vadim a tight-mouthed, venomous look. "It is dinner," she snapped. "That girl ought to have been here some hours ago. The sun will be down before the food is cold." "Do you not see us sitting here, woman? We would all like to eat. Let us wait in peace." She scowled and gripped the spoon in both of her knobby hands, wringing it like a rag. Vadim thought he could feel her glare drilling into the side of his head when he looked away. Better than that persistent tap-tap-tap. He glanced at his aunt and uncle, who seemed absorbed in their own hushed conversation, throwing gestures in the direction of the door. His cousins and their children were looking at him with a range of expressions, from bored grimaces to sympathetic smiles. Vadim pressed his lips together and dropped his gaze to the empty table. Maria had been out walking the fields, as she had done nearly every day since her mother's passing. The only time the family could be sure to see her was during meals. Even then, like a breeze with an appetite, she was there and gone. And now, he supposed, she was skipping them altogether. Distance he would abide, but absence and hunger he could not. He put his hands on the table and pushed himself up. "I will be back with Maria. Galina!" She was still staring at him. "Do not wait for me. Only make sure there's enough food left for me and my daughter." She continued to eye him severely for several more seconds, gave him one solemn nod, and then set about pouring bowls of porridge and black bread. Outside, the evening had grown darker already than he'd expected. The sun was only a red sliver resting on the hills. Maria had no love for rules, but she knew better than to be out at night on her own. She was frightened by the dark. Too many of her grandfather's tales, he suspected. As he walked the paths, he tried to conjure in his head all the many night creatures a girl of 11 might imagine. Wild, rail-thin wupiri, looking for throats to suckle. Throngs of twisted, childlike navki, wailing for their mothers. The 1,000 sharp-toothed, unnamed things that only a girl of her age could dream up. Maria believed in these things. She wouldn't stay out to face them on her own. This much Vadim knew. After what he thought might have been a mile or more of walking and calling out her name, he was beginning to worry. It hadn't genuinely crossed his mind until that point that something could have happened to her. There were few true dangers this close to the city and this far from the forest, yet there was no sign of her any place he looked. It could be that some bandit found her, although there were never bandits here. A lone wolf, maybe. Vadim pushed the thought out of his mind and began to walk faster. It wasn't until he approached the place where the Diezno River cut through the nearby hills that he made any progress at all. From afar, it looked like somebody had built a fire down in the gulch. Flickering yellow light glowed against the purpling twilight beyond the cliff's edge. He heard the sound of Maria's voice. "Masha!" he called to her. She fell silent. The light died away. "Masha, what are you doing in there?" When he crested the hill and looked into the gulch, all he saw was the river running wide and black below, and his daughter sitting on the grassy shelf between where he was standing and the water. Her mother's blanket was wrapped tight around her. She looked back at him with wide eyes, mouth hanging open. "Masha," he repeated a third time. "What was that? Are you playing with fire in there? Answer me, girl." "Go away." They stared at each other. There was no childish impudence in these words. She meant them. He could see it in the line between her eyebrows and the firm set of her jaw. Every paternal instinct he'd learned told him to crush this behavior, quick, before it could take root. This was something that would not do from a child to her father. But then there were the months of silence and the whispers to an absent father in the night. Somewhere there was a mother lying gray in her coffin. "I cannot, Masha. It is late, and if you can believe it, I am more afraid of the dark than you are sometimes. If this is what you want, to be out here, away from home, then I will stay where I am, and you can stay where you are. That way you will at least be safe." "No," she hissed. "Go away. I do not want you." "No?" He took a knee at the cliff's edge to look her in the eyes. "Well, what do you want?" "I want my papa." He furrowed his brow at her. "What do you mean? I'm right here, Masha. Look. He reached toward her with an outstretched hand. No! Masha squealed. She recoiled from his hand as if it were a hot fire iron and covered her head with the blanket. Do not touch me. You are not my papa. You are never my papa. Mama hated you. I know she did. Go away. Go away. Masha. Go away. Go away. Go away. Stop this, Masha, Vadim thundered. You are going to stop this now, and you are going to come home with me. She clamped the blanket down tight over her ears and continued her chorus of go away, go away, go away, to drown him out. Unable to make sense of what was happening and unable to communicate, Vadim seized the corner of the blanket in his outstretched hand. Maria screamed and clung to it with both hands. Papa, help me! He's trying to take you away from me! Quiet, girl, said Vadim, pulling the blanket and Maria closer. You are not making sense. I am going to take you home, and we are going to set this thing right. Papa, please. Tears were streaming down her face. You have to come out. He is going to take you. Before Vadim could begin to wonder what that meant, the blanket grew warm in his hand. The wool fibers suddenly felt like they were all spun from embers. He thought for a moment that it might be going up in flame, but as he watched, he realized that wasn't the case at all. The threads were unraveling, the stitching flowing free into the air. They weren't being consumed by a fire. Together, they were becoming the fire. Vadim knew somewhere in his mind that his hand was burning, but he forgot to let go. Instead, he watched wordlessly as the fire unfolded into a massive archway around him and Maria. 3 stalks blossomed from its peak, and then the flames began to die. Each tongue of fire collapsed onto itself into shapes more rigid, until they had all hardened into plates of red iron. 3 faces stared down at Vadim, one at the end of each scaled stalk.
Look at you,
said the beast in 3 separate voices.
Look how small and weak and full of anger you are.
It showed Vadim its iron teeth. They gleamed in the dusklight.
You could never be my Masha's father. Oliesia could never love you.
He could hear his heart pounding in his ears. He took a step backward without thinking.
You are afraid. That is good. But I will not kill you now, Vadimka Krovyapitovich. Your life is my payment to you for the years of keeping my Masha safe. Now go home, man, and spend what I have given you well.
It scooped Maria up in one of its enormous, knife-sharp talons. She clung to its leg, watching Vadim with wary eyes as the beast flapped its wings once, twice, 3 times, hefting itself into the air. He wanted to open his mouth, call out to her, reach after them with his singed hand, but found himself transfixed with a dozen emotions he didn't understand. His body would only let him watch as they took to the darkling sky. And then she was gone.
Viera, leave me alone with my son.
Vadim's mother was in the middle of tightening a poultice around his hand. She gave the knot one final tug and raised an eyebrow at her husband. Your son? He is just as much mine, Yasha. I would like to stay.
You cannot. There are things I must discuss with him, a man to his son. Go.
She shot Vadim a confidential glance. The expression on her face was one he knew well. Can you believe this man? It said. He smiled placatingly back at her. She gathered the wrappings and herbs into her basket, shaking her head and muttering inaudibly to herself on the way out. Krovya waited for the sound of the door, even cast a backward glance to make sure she was truly gone, and then turned his great carved chair to face Vadim.
You did not come here in the night alone so that your mother could wrap these for you, did you, Vadimka? You know how I feel about cowardice. Tell me what has happened, or say nothing.
In the dim light of the candles, his father's eyes were 2 dark spots with blades glinting out of the center. He felt if he stared at them for too long, he might be pierced. He swallowed hard and sat for several long seconds, thinking of how to begin.
There are steel dragons in this world,
Vadim began slowly. There was a tremor in his voice.
Yes, said Krovya. Tell me what you know of them.
And so he did. He reminded his father of Maria's months of strangeness, the way she'd kept from the house all throughout the day, the way that she'd been speaking in her sleep, the way that her mother's blanket had never been out of arm's reach. He told his father of the night he'd listened to her through the door, and the way that she'd spoken to Papa, although he was not there. He told his father about tonight, the absence, the strange light, the cruel words, the beast. The only thing he didn't tell his father about was the dream. Krovya listened with the stillness of a statue, fingers laced together pensively in front of his mouth. When Vadim was done, he lowered his hands onto the rests of his throne. Vadim could see the veins in his father's hands as he grasped the ornaments.
Have you spoken of this to anyone else?
Who would have believed me? When Vadim spoke, he was afraid of the sound in his own voice. Weakness. Fear. He tried to swallow them down, but the thought of his little Maria saying the things she had said, choosing to fly away in the beast's claws, was enough to keep his mouth dry and his mind reeling. And if they had, what could they have done? It would have destroyed the village, Papa. The entire city. Krovya's grip on the chair seemed to tighten. Vadim wondered for a moment whether the wooden ornaments would splinter in his hands. The large man closed his eyes and took a deep breath, then let it back out.
Walk with me, Vadimka. There is something you must see. I was only a boy when Aunt Malyusha told me her dream,
he continued as they walked together through the palatial izba.
12 draughts of dragon's blood you shall have, she told me, and for each cup another wonder. The first shall give you eyes to see, the second ears to hear, the third shall give you fingertips to touch and hold and feel, the fourth shall be sweet mead to you and the smell of fallen rain, the fifth shall part your quiet lips and it shall be your words, the sixth shall be a devilish speed, the seventh strength of limb, the eighth shall be a matchless wit to deceive and fool and trick, the ninth shall be good peace to you, and nothing shall you fear, the 10th shall set your soul ablaze to chase away the night, the 11th shall your shield be, skin as hard as iron, and 12 shall be your timeless song, a youth that never fades.
Vadim was more familiar with the tale of the 12 draughts than perhaps anyone save the bards who wrote it. This was not that tale. Not quite. In every telling he'd heard, it went, and 12 shall be your end of toil, your wealth and infamy. Vadim stared at his father. His cheeks had become hollows beneath his sharp cheekbones. His beard fell like a wide silver icicle from his chin. Tiny brown liver spots had begun to spring up on his forehead. It seemed impossible that this man, the indomitable dragon slayer Krovyapit Dobrynyich, one of the last living bogatiri, could yield to something as simple as the passage of time. Yet here were the wrinkles and tremors, doing something no dragon ever could. Krovya pushed open the cellar door and motioned for Vadim to enter.
You know my song, but you do not yet know the truth of it. Come, I will show you the depth of your father's shame.
Vadim followed him into the dark, past the pots of grain and kegs of mead. In the flickering light of Krovya's candle, he saw a tall shape huddled in the corner of the room. It looked like a man hiding beneath an ancient, dust-matted blanket. Krovya took hold of it in one hand and pulled away the animal hide covering. It took a moment for Vadim to understand what he was seeing. What looked at first like a person resolved into a vaguely person-shaped rack. It wore a pointed steel helmet and a coat of interwoven rings. In its wooden hand, it held a spear.
You have never known Krovyapit Dobrynyich. I am only an old man with too much in his belly. This,
he said, running a hand over the rust-pocked surface of the chainmail,
is your true father.
Why do you keep it down here in the dark? The faint sentimentality on his father's face collapsed into bitterness. His hand fell away.
This,
he said after a moment, taking the spear unceremoniously in one hand,
is my father's spear. It is a dull, unimpressive thing. See the bend in the tip there? But prick a dragon through its scales, and the blood will pour out like an upturned jug until there is nothing left.
He held the tip close to Vadim's face. Vadim remembered the beast's red iron scales. The spear didn't seem to be sharp enough to pierce anything, much less plate iron.
It has tasted the blood of 11 dragons. Tonight, you have met the one who should have been its 12th, Zmienia Kazatin.
Vadim felt himself frown. Zmienia Kazatin was long dead. When the beast stole one of the Grand Prince's daughters from under his nose, it was Krovyapit Dobrynich who killed him and rescued the girl. It was a truth known even to the smallest child in the most remote village, for the songs and the tales had told them. He still remembered celebrating Olyesia's return to the court of her father, Vladimir the Great. He remembered the new music of Krovya's victory, ringing fresh through the palace halls. He remembered his betrothal to her and the consummation ceremony. He remembered the blanket, always by her side.
You did not kill Nyakazatin.
His father exhaled through his nose and slumped backward against the cellar wall.
You know now why I never liked for them to sing my songs. I found Olyesia in Nyakazatin's cave, but never the beast himself.
He looked at Vadim very seriously.
There are ways to find a dragon, Vadim. I know them. I am the one who created them. When I was your age, I could taste a dragon's breath on the wind a mile away.
His eyes flicked back to the armor rack. The look in them drifted slowly from anger to something like exhaustion.
I never thought she would hide him from me. No dragon should have the patience to wait for so long, the humility to live in such a pathetic shape. A blanket,
he mused to himself, shaking his head. Vadim put his hands on his face, as if he could reach into his head and hold his fragmenting thoughts together. His body collapsed against the cellar wall, and then onto his knees. He stuttered beneath his palms. She was keeping him? The dragon? She was keeping him under my roof? In my bed? She passed him to my daughter? His father didn't look at him.
It would seem. I am a fool not to have seen it sooner.
Why? Vadim began to say, and then choked on the word. His throat felt tight, mouth dry. Why did my Masha go with him? Why did she call him Papa? There was a long silence between them.
It is a ruse,
his father finally said. Some of the fire was beginning to return to his eyes as he spoke. A deep line had formed between his brows.
A dragon's game. He fooled Olyesia into hiding him from me until now, and he will fool your daughter if you let him.
He used the spear like a walking stick to straighten himself. Vadim looked up, and in the dim light, the years seemed to have sloughed away. With the spear in his hand, Krovya looked every bit the warrior from the songs.
I know this moment,
his father continued, voice fairly thundering.
The world has been taken from you by a beast of fire and iron, and you are only a man. What is there that can be done?
Krovya extended the spear to his son.
You are only a man, but I was only a child when I heard Malusha's dream. You are weak, but I was crippled when I cut my first draught out of a dragon.
His father towered over him in the dim light. In his hand, the spear almost seemed too large for Vadim to handle. He reached with two trembling hands. They felt too small for the task.
Their blood may not do for you as it did for me, but you still have so much life before you. Take me for a shield, your grandfather's spear for a weapon. You will have a song yet, Vadimka.
Vadim closed his hands around the haft. The sun was only beginning to peek over the horizon when they came to the mouth of the cave. It had been 2 hard days of hiking, Krovya pausing every mile or so to feel the ground with his hands, the disturbed bark of trees. At times he would simply stop, close his eyes, take in a deep breath, and then start off in a new direction. Watching him hunt was like watching an animal take a scent. It seemed all impulse to Vadim, hardly a moment to reflect. He wondered at times whether his father still knew what he was doing, even after all these years. But at last they arrived. It was unmistakable now that he was seeing it with his own eyes. The banks of the lake had been trampled by giant paws, the edges of the cave's mouth scratched and worn as if by the passage of a creature that barely fit inside. Standing in front of the dark opening, Vadim thought he could feel the heat of its breath emanating from within. He tightened his grip on the spear. Somewhere behind him, his father grunted. Vadim turned his head and watched over a shoulder as Krovya walked past the cave's mouth and toward the shore. He bent down to touch the moss and the mud with his hands, laughed quietly to himself, and then began to wade out into the water.
"You've had me once,"
he said, approaching a shriveled ash tree that bent out of the shallows like a spent torch.
"I will tell you that I am in awe of how long you have made it last. But now,"
he reached up to his full height, taller than any man Vadim had ever known, and bunched the tree's 3 barren branches into his hands.
"you'll have to find better tricks."
He began to bend the branches down toward the water. They seemed to go easily at first, but the more the trunk of the tree curved, the more Vadim could see the veins standing out on his father's forearms. The tree seemed to shudder against his strength. The roots, which had been peeking out from under the water's surface, shifted down into the mire like grasping fingers.
"I can feel you fighting me. Are you so afraid to die that you would rather leave this world as an uprooted tree than the dragon Nirkazatin? Have some pride, beast."
The tree only cracked and groaned as its branches bent near the water.
"I will draw you out then. Vadim, be ready."
Vadim turned his back on the cave entrance and stared at the scene unfolding before him. In none of their planning during the 2-day hunt had they discussed anything like this. They should have been creating an ambush at the mouth of the cave or luring the dragon into a trap. Instead, his father was grappling with a frail tree in a lake. He knew the reason, but found it difficult to trust his eyes. He stepped into the shallows, brandishing his grandfather's spear at the tree. Cold water began to flood his boots. Krovya bellowed and, with one final exertion, forced the limbs of the tree into the lake. He held them under for what felt like minutes. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the tide against the shore. As the seconds wore on, Vadim wondered whether he should be feeling more of frustration, confusion, or relief. And then the flames began. The bark of the tree started to crack and peel, and then all at once erupted into a cone of streaming fire. The air around the tree became a cloud of steam as the water boiled against its trunk. At its peak, each point of flame darkened and fell into the red iron scales of the dragon's back. The roots became its haunches and claws and tails, branches 3 outstretched necks. Krovya still held its heads, submerged together beneath the water's surface. He laughed, the first true laughter Vadim had heard from his father in more than a year, and pulled them back out from under the water.
"There, we finally meet. It seems your wit is the best of your weapons. You are small for your kind, Kalyushka."
Nirkazatin's body tensed as if he would spring, mouths open wide. Vadim could just see the beginnings of smoke billowing out of his throats, but then his father was wrenching them together in his arms to stymie the flow. He twisted Nirkazatin by his heads, and the dragon was forced to roll onto his back.
"Small, but you are not without fire. My son's song will treat your memory well."
Krovya locked eyes with his son. There, in his old armor, a dragon so easily trapped in his arms, he looked like a different person. The old man in the feasting hall with the aversion to his own music had never been Krovya Pitobrinic at all. He had been a husband, a father, a grandfather. He had been his wife's Yasha, Vadim's papa. This man staring back at him through the steam with his stolid eyes was no one Vadim had ever known. He nodded at this new man and waded through the water toward the dragon.
"It is your time, Vadim. Let your song begin."
He leveled the spear against the dragon's hide. The steel tip scraped across the iron scales, leaving a white line. He tightened his grip on the haft, widened his stance, and readied to push. Something small thudded against his back. "No," came the sound of Maria's voice. "You cannot take him. You cannot take my papa away from me." She was pounding on Vadim's back with both of her small fists, a little voice straining at the absolute height of its volume. She saw the spear and made a frantic grab for it. Vadim pulled it out of her way just in time, and she fell into the water. Vadim readied the spear again to strike, and then paused. Maria wasn't wearing her unseasonal winter attire anymore. She wasn't wearing anything at all. He could see something rough and red stuck to the bare skin of her back like a giant scab. He reached down to touch it. It was cool and smooth against his fingertips, like metal. She felt his fingers against her back and shrunk away from him, But he had the thing between his forefinger and thumb now. In the new space between them, it unfolded into a small pair of scaled red wings. Vadim let go of them. He looked from Maria's teary-eyed face to the center face of the dragon. In all the many years of their marriage, Olesya had never touched him the way she had touched her blanket. She had never spoken to him with the same love in her voice as when she spoke to her daughter. Their bed had long been cold, affections shriveled away. They were husband and wife, and they did care for each other after a fashion, but there had always been a strange distance that he could not understand. Not until now.
"This," he said slowly, "is her father."
Krovya lowered his eyebrows at his son.
"It is a dragon's ruse, Vadim. Dispatch the beast, and I will show you."
The months since Olesya's death whirled through Vadim's mind. The way Maria had hidden herself in the heavy clothes and the blanket, her need for privacy, the whispers in the night. She was not becoming a woman. She was only becoming her father's child.
"I cannot."
Krovya scowled.
"Do not give up your life for a monster and his spawn." "It is nothing to give up. She may not be mine, but I have loved her as if she was. I still do." He glanced down at Maria again, who was staring at him with wide eyes. "You will need a family who understands what you are, Masha. Not a family of blood drinkers and cowards who venerate the death of your kind." "What of the many years they fooled you? Have you no pride?" Vadim scoffed. "Damn Olesya. We were married because we were bound to it. I tried to make something of it, but her heart was someplace else. Murdering my child's father will not change that." Krovya grit his teeth and let out a low sound like an animal defending its territory. "Ungrateful boy," he spat. "If you will not take my gift to you, then I will seize it myself. I have a 12th draught to drink." He tightened his hold on the dragon's throats. The beast began to writhe and groan in the water, tiny gouts of fire flashing out of its nostrils. Krovya's beard caught alight, but he didn't seem to notice. "No!" Maria cried again. Vadim felt her tugging at his pant leg. "Do something, Papa! You cannot let grandfather kill him!" He watched his father strangling Nyakazatin. There was a look in his eyes Vadim recognized. It had been there nights ago when he'd first told Krovya of the dragon. It was the look of a man dying of thirst, given something to drink. This was not his mother's Yasha. It was not his Masha's grandfather. It was not his Papa. This was something else. He pushed the cup away. Before he could think of what he was doing, Vadim took one long step past Maria and swung the spear in a wide arc. Krovya paused with his arms locked around Nyakazatin's neck. A small line of blood began to seep out of the back of his hand. His eyes flicked about, from Vadim to the spearhead to the dragon. He pulled his arms away and stared at the cut his son had made. The stream was already beginning to turn into a river. As it met the air, sparks and flames leapt up out of it. He staggered toward the shore absently, staring at the tiny wound. "What did you do?" The blood poured out of him. New clouds of steam billowed into the air as it hit the water. "Vadim," he stammered, trying to stymie the flow with his other hand. The hot liquid scalded his fingers and he pulled away. "Every draught I've ever won. My songs. My strength. Without them, His head hung, eyelids drooped. "Without them." There was a splash as he fell over into the shallow water. Vadim watched him begin to sink in his heavy armor. He knew Nyakazatin and Maria were watching, and he wondered in some far-off part of his mind what it looked like to them. Was it strange to see the man who had cut the power and perhaps the life out of Krovya Dobrynich drag him ashore? Was it strange to watch him kneel over the great man and search for signs of life? Vadim did not know the answer. All he knew was that Krovya was breathing, and the blood had stopped pouring out of him. For now, it was enough. He fell backward onto the mud and sat, at a loss for where his mind or his heart ought to be. "Papa," came a small, quivering voice from behind Vadim. He felt Maria's little hand on his back. "Papa, I am sorry. All the awful things I said to you. I did not know. I thought you would be like him. I thought if you knew what I was, you'd—" Her voice cracked, and Vadim could tell that she was crying.
He raised an arm and leaned to one side so that she could move around him. She ducked beneath it and threw her arms around his neck, face hidden in his chest.
I could never have anything but love for you, Masha. You are not my blood, but I raised you all the same. You are my little rabbit.
I am sorry, she repeated. He hushed her and ran his fingers through her hair as he'd always done. The hiss of boiling water sounded from where the tree had been. There was a flash of yellow light. Vadim turned his head in time to see a man emerging from the flames. His hair was the color of the fire, falling unkempt over his shoulders. His eyes seemed to glow like golden embers. Vadim could understand in a moment how Olesya was able to fall so deeply in love with a creature like him. He was more beautiful than any man had a right to be. Niakazatin stood in the water for several long seconds, watching Vadim and Maria. He glanced at Krovya, unconscious on the floor.
I believe I may have misjudged you, Vadim Krovyapitovich. Forgive me. I once tried to live among your kind, but...
He raised his arms in a vague gesture to the scene before him.
I have since learned not to be so trusting.
Vadim let out a long breath as if he'd been holding it in for years. His eyes went to the man who had been his father.
As have I, Zmei Niakazatin.
Niakazatin waded through the water to join them on the shore. What will you do now? He said, rubbing his neck with an idle hand. Vadim could see the red lines where Krovya had held him.
This seems a mess.
Vadim nodded and began to think. He imagined what would happen to his father if he left him here. What if, without the dragon's blood in him, he woke up as he was born? No senses, as good as dead.
I suppose I must take Krovyapit home. After that,
he shrugged.
I do not know. I do not think I can stay there after what I have done.
Maria frowned at Vadim, the way a child looks when they're trying to understand something. Can we help? She said, turning to Niakazatin. Can you carry that much? His eyebrows came together in thought. He rubbed his chin.
I can. I'm sure of it. I would be grateful, said Vadim.
Niakazatin nodded slowly.
It is nothing to me. Where shall I take you after?
Vadim had no answer for that. He never in his life truly considered leaving home, least of all in exile. His gaze drifted back and forth between Niakazatin and Maria. The little girl stood up, holding Vadim's hand in hers. She reached for Niakazatin's, and he gave it to her. I cannot have Mama back, she began, a look of serious contemplation taking over her expression. But I would like to have both of you. Niakazatin smirked. Vadim thought he saw a wisp of flame curl out of his nostril.
I will go wherever you do, Masha.
As will I, said Vadim, resting a second hand on top of hers. Niakazatin raised his eyebrows at Vadim. Even if it means keeping the company of a monster? Vadim scoffed, and though his heart was still pounding, mind still reeling, hands still trembling with everything that had happened, he felt himself smile.
I have kept company with worse.
And with that, our Slavic Folklore series winds to a close. Thanks for tolerating my terrible accents and pronunciations. Humans can be tricky to emulate at the best of times, and these folklore series are quite the anthropological journey. This story has some interesting qualities. First and foremost, the sheer volume of dads. It was pure coincidence that we wrote a story with no fewer than 3 dads as central plot figures this close to Father's Day, but we don't mind taking a little credit for it. Happy late Father's Day to all the dads who may be watching. Second, unlike most of the stories we write, this one is not very internal. That's because we had to use some of what we talked about in our Slavic Folklore episode and write a tale based on the myth, which forced us to write a little bit more classically this time. It was an interesting experience, in some ways easier, in some ways not. Let us know what you think of this one and how it compares to the rest. Maybe we'll try more of this in the future. At any rate, this is where our Slavic Folklore series comes to an end. Thanks for joining us, and keep making stuff up. We'll see you next time. До свидания.